Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with the Haydn Symphony Crusade. And today we're going to talk about Symphony number 13. Now, all of these symphonies have original or interesting or unique features shared by no other works in quite the same way. You know, it's like a recipe. You take the similar ingredients. You know, you're going to bake a cake, you need flour and eggs, but the proportions are always different. And it's the difference in proportion that makes these symphonies special. And number 13 is no exception to that rule. Number 13 has some extremely novel features. It is the first Haydn symphony we're talking about that uses timpani. Now, some performances omit the timpani because a lot of the manuscripts having disappeared, we've reconstructed these symphonies using copies. And the copies can come from different sources, and depending on the popularity of the symphony, there may be lots of copies or very few. And so some of the copies may include timpani parts and some may not. It really has to do with the copyist. And so then the question becomes, did Haydn write them or did the copyist stick them in there for some reason because they happen to be available? I happen to think this symphony sounds quite fine with timpani. But then again, my position on these pieces is really very simple. My feeling is that if it's a contemporary copy of a reasonably decent provenance, you always go for the one that has more stuff. Always. Because I have never met a composer who ever said, I want less. None of them did. Ever. No great composer in history. You know, you hear a lot of that sort of foolishness talking about like Brahms with the Meiningen Court Orchestra, for example, which was very small and premiered a lot of his symphonies, and Brahms loved them. He was very happy, but he wanted a big orchestra when he can get one. And Haydn and Beethoven and Mozart, they all wanted as many people as they could get their hands on. The only limitation to what they wanted to do was financial, which is the same thing that it is today. And the period instrument people particularly like to talk about doing things on a teeny tiny scale and claim that that's authentic, which is bullshit. There's nothing authentic about it if by authenticity we mean trying to realize the composer's intentions, ideally in terms that he could have heard had we been around to the day. If, on the other hand, you're trying to do a performance that's like, well, we know that last Tuesday in 1862, half of the orchestra was sick and the rest had syphilis and 4 or 5 of them had typhoid. So in one performance, there was only, 2 violins and 2/3 of a viola and 5/8 of a cello and maybe 129ths of a double bass, and the flute player had to play the oboe. So we're going to do a performance with 6 people, and that's authentic because it really happened. Well, that's not the point. That is absolutely not the point. Tovey said it best, my favorite line, which I never cease to love to quote, which is, he said something like, and I'm paraphrasing a little, but he said, musical scholarship is not obliged to insist on the restoration of conditions that ought never to have existed. And 90% of what the period instrument people do consists of a performance condition that should never have existed in the first place, because the composer would never have tolerated it if they had a choice. So, with that rant out of the way, let's talk about Haydn. Yes, you should use the timpani if you can. And in Symphony number 13, he had a uniquely large orchestra because he has a flute, which is always nice to have on the top there, and 2 oboes and strings with a bassoon and continuo thing on the bottom if you want to stick it in, because Haydn never wrote for one, but people stick it in anyway. But the most amazing thing about this symphony is that it has 4 horns. And that is a big deal because 4 horns allows Haydn to write big, fat, yummy, sustained chords. It's not to let the horn parts go nuts, although he uses them because he has them. He does use horns more effectively also as solo instruments than he normally would have had the opportunity to do. But what really matters is that they can fill in the texture and create an extra richness. And he exploits that immediately. Because one of the two unique things I'm going to ask you, well, three unique things that I'm going to ask you to listen to when we hear this symphony, the first of them is texture. This symphony is a celebration of texture. All different kinds of texture, especially in the outer movements, but also in the inner movements in a different way. In the first movement, you have block chords, big, yummy, sustained chords with motion in front of them. That is, melodies or motives in smaller notes pasted on top of those big fat chords. And that the result of that is really rather extraordinary. It has an amazing effect on our perception of musical motion. You'll hear that right away at the beginning of the exposition, where the opening theme isn't really much of a theme. It's an arpeggio up and down the scale, more or less, against these long-held sustained chords, mostly in the horns, but also with the oboes and the flute there as well. But wind chords and string movement in front of them. But the result of that is that when you hear these big, long, sustained chords, when they stop, there's a totally different perception of how fast the music's moving and whether it's moving at all. The opening phrase, it's like stretching out a spring or a rubber band, and then all of a sudden it snaps and the music jumps forward, and the tempo hasn't changed at all. All that's changed is the harmonic movement, the rate at which the harmonies change, and the rate at which the notes are written. They're faster notes versus longer, slower notes, and Haydn exploits that contrast magnificently in the first movement. And I'm going to play you the first movement, really the whole movement. We can do the whole thing, and because it's not all that long, and you'll hear exactly what I mean. It's quite marvelous. You'll also hear in the recapitulation a splendid, splendid solo for the four horns. They finally get something to do besides having just sustained chords. You get to hear them get the tune, which is quite wonderful. And throughout this movement, I want you to pay attention to differences in texture. The other big difference that Haydn is going to exploit throughout this symphony is going to be interesting changes of rhythm. Now, any symphony of this period is going to have changes in rhythm, obviously. There'll be different movements, will be in different meters. Sometimes there'll be syncopated accents, passages with accompaniments that have different patterns and ostinatos, as they're called, which means repeated rhythmic cells that are used as accompaniment. That's all standard stuff. It really is. But in order to make it something that's symphonic, something that you really, really grasp as a motivic principle that's driving the music and generating the music and unifying the music, especially in these outer movements, you have to do something special with these unusual rhythmic gambits, if you want to call them that. And in this case, we're talking about a syncopated rhythm. Now, syncopations are, accents that do not occur on the regular beat. So in this particular case, you've got a movement that's basically in 1, 2, 3, 4. It's in 2 or 4 or something like that. Doesn't matter which. But a syncopation, instead of going 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, it's going to be going 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, like that. And so in this case, the syncopations occur in the second subject of the sonata movement. And I'll indicate when it occurs. It's a little superscript here, when it occurs as you're listening. But the point is that the second subject is nothing but that. It's not a theme. It has no melodic profile at all. It's simply a syncopated rhythm, which makes it, first of all, unforgettable, because it's in a very specific place. But more importantly, Haydn brings it back in the finale, where the syncopated rhythm is also the second subject of the finale in the same place. So by doing the same thing in the same place in different movements, Haydn creates a feeling of unity throughout the entire symphony, across the entire work. And that is one of the things that Haydn began to exploit, and because, as I always said, and as Haydn himself said, he considered his works whole. And so all of these symphonies have things that bind them together, that make Symphony number 13 not number 14 and not number 12. So here is the opening movement of Symphony number 13, performed by the Cologne Chamber Orchestra on Naxos, conducted by Helmut Müller-Brühl. Helmut Müller-Brühl is a nice guy. We gave him an award at the Cannes Classical Awards, and he was really a charming and pleasant person. So, and he conducts a very good Symphony number 13 with the timpani parts. Here we go, first movement. So, you heard those broad contrasts in texture and the difference between the syncopated rhythm and the regular rhythm. Now, the inner movements are also related in a way, because this is typical of Haydn, and it gives us a little insight into what makes something symphonic. Now, the slow movement is remarkable because it's a cello solo, period. The entire movement, from beginning to end, is a very long, very elaborate aria for solo cello accompanied by the strings. And Haydn had a really fine solo cellist in the Esterházy Orchestra, and so he wrote for the cello quite frequently in his symphonies. And this movement is the apotheosis of that early classical, highly ornate, very, very beautiful, very singing cello writing. I mean, the idea of playing this on a period cello with no vibrato is just horrifying beyond words. This music is marked Cantabile, and period sources tell us Cantabile means use vibrato. It means singing. And here is, I'm just going to play you the exposition so you get the idea. But the entire movement is this cello solo. And Haydn spins it out. He writes out a lot of the ornamentation. He doesn't leave a lot of room for individual elaboration. This is a highly elaborate, very virtuosic solo designed to really showcase the taste, the elegance, the refinement, the vocal singing quality of the orchestra's principal cellist. So here is the opening. Lovely, isn't it? Really beautiful. It's a gorgeous movement. Now the minuet is also special in certain ways. It contains in its trio section, which I'm not going to play you, but I just need to describe it for the purpose you'll understand in a second. The middle section, this trio, is a flute solo. So in the second movement, we had a cello solo, and in the minuet, the central section, we have a flute solo, lightly accompanied by the strings. Of course, the tune is totally different. The rhythm is totally different. They're not related. What they are both is solo. And so now the concept of solo is carried through multiple movements of the symphony. And that is one of the things that makes it symphonic. Rather than just having this elaborate cello solo just because, and then it disappears, and we never hear anything similar again, we hear a similar idea in the minuet, but realized in completely fresh and new terms. That's a symphonic ideal. The idea that these musical conceptions constantly develop and renew themselves, but in different ways. That's what makes Haydn's symphonies so special as compared to a lot of the run-of-the-mill symphonies written at the same time. So this soloistic character of these inner movements makes something symphonic when it otherwise would have been just sort of a one-off special feature with no particular significance. But now Haydn is saying something. He's saying, see what I can do with my orchestra using the principle of solo. But the outer parts of the minuet, which is what I am going to play you, oh, they're so much fun. This is another one of Haydn's symphonic minuets. And we've seen that in the first movement, he deals in syncopation. And in this movement, he deals with unusual phrasing, which in a way is a form of syncopation. The rhythm is anything but danceable. You know it's a minuet. You know it's going 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. But just imagine somebody trying to dance to this stuff. There is no way it could happen. I mean, they would be tripping all over themselves. It's full of strange rhythmic emphases and odd little pauses and extended phrases that add a few steps just when you think it shouldn't. It's marvelous. Absolutely marvelous. So I'm going to play you the whole minuet without repeats, straight through, just so you get a sense of it. And just try and imagine somebody dancing to this. It ain't going to happen. And the dancers all just broke their ankles, tripping on each other. Well, they all had long dresses and the men wore swords. It was a mess anyway. But really, it's just wonderful. Haydn's symphonic minuets are like no others. Nobody wrote better minuets, more entertaining minuets, because they're unexpected on the one hand, but also rhythmic and dance-like, as opposed to being danceable on the other hand. But now we come to the finale. The remarkable, amazing finale. Now, I've already treated this finale pretty extensively in my prequels to Mozart's Jupiter Symphony, because this finale uses the main motive of Mozart's Jupiter Symphony, which was only going to be written about 28 years later. The motive in question is not unique. It's a tag. It's a formula. It's a contrapuntal formula. And so Haydn's using it for the same reason as Mozart uses it, because he can indulge in counterpoint. And in this finale, whereas in the first movement, the contrast was between static chords and music that moved very quickly in the sonata style, motion music, in this finale, the contrast is between counterpoint, contrapuntal episodes, and the more normal kind of motivic material, movement material between the contrapuntal episodes. And those contrapuntal episodes are always characterized by that four-note motive, da, 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 with quicker music on top of it. So that is wonderful. And counterpoint has a fabulous revivifying effect on music of the classical period when it's used as Haydn uses it, not to write a fugue, not in a formal way, but in an ongoing developmental way within the overall structure, incorporated into the wider form. What it does is it makes you listen vertically. Sonata form music, such as Haydn's writing, is horizontal music. It starts at point A, it goes to point B, zips around points C, D, and E, or however many, winds up back at point A. But it goes this way and back. It moves around. Counterpoint tends to be monumental. It's rhetorical speech. It's not dramatic speech. It stays in one place. It grows architecturally like a structure. And so by including a good bit of counterpoint within the context of his finale, what Haydn does is he creates music. Again, he's dealing with your perception of time and movement. You listen vertically in one spot, more or less, even though the music's going along, through time. And then he moves it along. And so you have this variety of tempo on the one hand, and on the other hand, a certain monumentality of sections, the more architectural sections. And that gives this finale an extraordinary amount of weight and seriousness, something that really balances out the first movement as a counterpoise to it. And that gives the whole symphony, in turn, a sense of very elegant but also large proportion compared to some of the earlier symphonies that we've played. This is a big work. It sounds like a big work. And so in having just two extra horns and a flute, these tiny little differences have big musical implications for the way Haydn is going to treat the orchestra, and also for the kind of themes that he writes for the instruments to play. So I'm going to play you the entire finale. And also, as I said before in this finale, the second subject consists entirely of syncopations. That's really kind of cool, because so did the second subject of the first movement. And I'm going to play you just the syncopated bits from each movement. I've done a little syncopated comparison with a 1 second pause between them, and you can hear immediately. It's the same type of music. And it doesn't matter what notes they play. It doesn't matter whether there's a tune or not a tune. What matters is the rhythm. That's what tells us what's going on. And it's the second subject of each of these movements, which is just beyond cool. Here, listen to this. Listen to the syncopations. Okay, so you see what I mean? It's clear as day, right? So now let's listen to the entire finale with the motive from the Jupiter Symphony that became famous in the Jupiter Symphony, but that Haydn was using 30 or so years earlier, and you'll have a wonderful sense of this really grand and big sounding symphony in D major, by the way, which is always a nice key for the strings and for the horns, and it's just glorious. Here it is. So that was the entire finale without repeats. There's no reason to do the repeats. But, when you listen to it, you probably will hear repeats, at least first time repeat and possibly the second half repeat as well. A glorious, glorious symphony full of contrast and texture and color and rhythm. Just, what Haydn always does, but at the same time that has cohesion, that has unity, that has the true symphonic logic underlying every single bar. It's magnificent. So I hope you enjoyed this little rendezvous with Symphony number 13, the Lucky 13. Keep on listening, folks. Thank you so much for joining me on this Haydn Symphony Crusade.